So the five we talked about there, we talked about others are, obviously, it's no surprise, number one is create jobs. What can we do to create jobs? And then, we kick around at these sessions, is it good to lower the tax burden? If so, is it income taxes? Is it targeted towards consumers, middle class taxpayers? Is it small businesses? Or is it property taxes? Is it a combination of that? What other ideas are there? So first off is create jobs. Secondly is develop the workforce. Because what I've heard repeatedly from employers in every part of the state, and usually in about three key areas, although it's true in others as well. Without a doubt, manufacturing, particularly advanced manufacturing, IT-related services, and in healthcare. I hear we have jobs, we just don't have enough workers with the skill sets needed to fill those jobs. So whether it's engineers or welders or fabricators or machinists, whether it's IT technicians or software developers, or whether it's certified nursing assistants, RNs, physicians, those are all areas I hear increasingly from employers. We have jobs, we just don't have enough workers to fill those jobs. And so as you can imagine, that's an area that particularly frustrates me. It's not unique to Wisconsin. I talked to other governors. Heck, I talked to the president in February about it. So it's not unique to our state. But it is one where I think it's frustrating, just in the sense that even though our unemployment rate below 7% is a lot better than it was a couple of years ago at over 9%, still there's too many people either looking for work or looking for a better job than they have. And here we've got these jobs, many of which pay good, family-sustaining, anywhere from $50,000 to $70,000 for a lot of the manufacturing jobs. And so some of the things we're looking at, still very fluid, because we're just in the, not in the early stages, but we're not complete with the budget yet, which is why we're getting the feedback, saying Be Bold 2 and Tim Sullivan's report both gave us a series of recommendations, a lot of which we're trying to sort through and decide which and to what degree to engage in that. But investing more in our technical colleges, investing more in higher ed, even doing things like dual enrollment in our high schools to help kids get not only credit for graduation, but potentially credit for a technical degree if there's a program like that in their schools. All those things trying to align where we know there are jobs open today, both to help the employers, but also to help the whether it's traditional students or whether it's someone who's been unemployed or underemployed, who's a non-traditional adult learner, get back into the workforce. So we look at investments like in our technical colleges. Part of what we're looking at is saying, yeah, it makes sense to put some more money in, but we don't just do a random, by formula. Maybe we should target it towards what areas have the greatest need out there, and can we put more resources there. We look at the UW system. We say not only is it just a blanket percentage increase, but the UW, to their credit, the system-wide has actually come back with some specific proposals for things that they would help drive economic development and workforce development in the state. So that's the second category, workforce development. The third one is transform education. We've done a number of things in the last couple of years that have helped in that regard, in that we've given more power to our local school boards to make decisions in terms of hiring and staffing and budgets. Most school districts now can hire based on merit. They can pay based on performance. It means if they want to pay more for their best and their brightest, they can do that and keep them there. But there are more things we can do. Dr. Tony Evers and I spent a lot of time the last year, almost a year and a half, putting the stakeholder group with people from teachers, school board members, principals, administrators, local community leaders, business leaders, parents, in a large stakeholder group. It's spent about a year's time, lawmakers from both parties as well, working on school and school district accountability. Actually, as a parent myself, I've been interested because my youngest is still at Wauwatosa East High School. They got their report card this fall. I think Dr. Evers and I were both surprised that in the end there wasn't as much pushback on that. We thought, anytime you measure things, people tend to start to freak out a little bit. But in the end, it was actually pretty positive. I think it was a reflection that most of our schools are performing well. Some are not, and some are failing. Thankfully, a small number are failing relative to the 424 school districts. But I think most people had a pretty good sense as to where they were at. And so now our next step is looking at, again, we'll probably do some sort of general school aid increase. How much remains to be seen, but a fair amount of the money we'd like to put in education, to me, would be targeted in a couple ways. If we've got these report cards and we've got this accountability system, to me there should be some incentive not only to perform well, to high achievement, but also for districts that move, that see growth, that see expansion. And maybe in our categorical, we'd like to see some way to reward and provide an incentive for those districts. By the same token, we can't completely ignore and put all the money in with the high performers. If we've got failing schools, we should provide some additional assistance for them. But with the caveat now with this grading system, if you will, of saying, if you're a failing school, we're not just going to give you more money. We want some sort of a corrective action, something that could be done in conjunction with the Department of Public Instruction, or some way where there's an objective standard saying, if you're failing and you want to get access, you want to turn around, we'll give you some assistance, but you're going to have to show us that you've actually got a corrective action plan. It's not just more money for the same thing that's been failing before. So that's part of what we're looking at potentially for the budget on transforming education. General government reform, kind of building off the Waste, Fraud, and Abuse Commissions, continued to give us recommendations. We've acted on the vast majority of things. We'd like to do more. Are there things that we can do to make government more efficient, more effective in the services we provide, and that's sort of the part. And then the final part's infrastructure. Investments in infrastructure, clearly, most obviously, transportation, and having a balanced approach statewide, particularly when it comes to highways, to bridges, to roads, but also looking at ways that we can have an intermodal system of freight rail. We just had, a few weeks ago, our second annual Governor's Conference on Freight, which involved motor carriers, freight rail, our ports and our airports, realizing that for manufacturers, particularly for dairy farmers, but for other agricultural entities and just business in general, you got to have an ability to get product to and from market. So transportation, freight transport is incredibly important. It's key to economic development. I also would add into infrastructure, transportation is the biggest dollar amount, but maintaining clean water, because that's a huge asset for our state, particularly in rural areas, trying to work with telecommunications companies to help ensure that there's access to high-speed internet connection all throughout the state, not just in our most populated areas, making sure there's cost-effective and reliable sources of power. And a lot of times we talk about economic development, when healthcare comes up, it comes up as a liability in terms of cost, and there's some issues about cost that need to be addressed at both the state and more so at the federal level with these exchanges. But to me, healthcare is also an asset, and it's an infrastructure issue that we want to make sure that we still have what I think is a strength right now, which is a quality healthcare system in nearly every part of the state of Wisconsin, and we want to make sure we continue to have that. So that's the fifth. So it's create jobs, develop the workforce, transform education, reform government, and continue to make strategic investments in infrastructure. There's the choice that we made back on November 16th about telling the federal government, granted it's more than a year now, it won't be until January 14 when the exchanges come, but there's the part, and I'll come back to in a second, about whether you have a state-run, a partnership, which is a hybrid of the two, or defer to a federal exchange. And then there's a question about whether or not you tap into the extending the Medicaid benefits. I haven't made a decision on Medicaid yet. There are, just kind of lay the cards on the table. There's some thought, we already have over 90% of the people in our state have some sort of coverage, either through private insurers, typically through their employer, or through some sort of government-aided assistance like Badger Care, Family Care, other things of that component. And so we're much higher. Other states, like Texas, has 25%, so there's a huge gap in the difference between the states. Much of what other states would get in terms of expanding the Medicaid benefits, we already cover because of the generous programs we offer in the state of Wisconsin. So on one hand, there's some things that we've been looking at and exploring, trying to decipher the dollar amount. There's some, just from a bean counter standpoint, there's some appeal to say, well, for anything we already cover, if there's any way we could get additional reimbursement beyond what we get right now, there might be some value. We're already doing much of it, not all of it, but much of it. Why not be able to get a higher drawdown? No doubt about it. The counter to that would be, and kind of what we're trying to piece through this is, excuse me, just on purely from an accounting standpoint, set aside some of these other concerns the person who asked you the question referenced. On the other side of the equation is, the Affordable Care Act in the law itself says for the first 3 years, if you take the expanded Medicaid benefits, you get 100% reimbursement. After 3 years, it goes down to 90%. That, by law, we know that. I would add to that, one of my ongoing concerns, and we see playing out before us right now in Washington, is that's today. Let's assume nothing changes in Washington. It already tells us we're going to go from 100% to 90%. So 3 years from now, we're already going to have to pick up 10% of that amount that that we take right now from the federal government. So we know right off the bat we're going to have to pay a higher amount. One of my real concerns, and other governors, including a number of Democrats, have expressed when we've had meetings with the National Governors Association, is how do we know that that's really going to happen? How do we know if we were to opt to take the reimbursement for the expanded Medicaid, that under this fiscal cliff agreement or some subsequent agreement, that amount might not go down to 80 or 75 or 70%, for which Wisconsin taxpayers, or any state that takes this, that local state taxpayers would have to pick up the tab on it. The reason I tell you that is a good example we've talked about here before, and certainly lawmakers as well as school district officials have talked about for years, is special education. Special education is a federal mandate. The federal government never comes close to funding that. They talked about it early on with the mandate, but for years at the state level and certainly at the school district level, there's complaints that there's the mandate for providing special education, the federal government has, but they've never come close, or not never. It's been years since they've come close to fully paying what that mandate costs. And so when I look at that, when I look at some of the other programs the federal government dictates to the states, there is a tremendous worry. It's not unique to me, it's not even unique to Republicans. There are other Democrats who worry that if we take this, what's the guarantee that even at that 90%, which we already know is a drop, is going to stay, or that it might drop down, and then are we on the hook? Because the federal government in the past has put in place what's called maintenance of effort agreements to say you can't, once you've taken this, you can't back out of it or you risk losing even more of the federal assistance. And so that's a real concern. It's already part of the problems we have with existing Medicaid. To me, without debating the whole Affordable Care Act, because obviously I have strong opinions on that, but I would like to, now that the exchange issue has been resolved, like to work with our congressional delegation, which is a nice mix between Republicans and Democrats, and try and say, are there ways that you can make this just easier for the states to deal with that aren't about, just debating a repeal or not of the Affordable Care Act. The other thing I just say is, and you're right, the person in Richmond said, yeah, it could be a magnet. I can't say that with absolute certainty, because one of our challenges, and also one of the reasons why I opted, amongst others, to defer to the federal government on the exchanges, we don't know. I mean, for all the talk, the time that's passed since the Affordable Care Act was actually enacted, HHS, the federal level, is still light years away from giving most states concrete answers as to what comes next, and it's one of the biggest concerns I hear from employers, many of whom just don't like the Affordable Care Act to begin with, but that aside, just are very concerned as to what it means next. And it's part of one of the main reasons why I opted to defer to the federal government. State exchanges in the end are no different than federal exchanges in terms of the federal government requires in terms of core substantive areas, what you deliver, how you deliver it is pretty much dictated by the federal government. Case in point, Utah, Gary Herbert's a good friend of mine, governor of Utah. Remember during the ACA debate, they pointed to Utah and said, look, they've got an exchange, which they do, about 6 years now. It was done by the market-driven, work with small businesses. They have some of the lowest healthcare costs in the country. They have great quality healthcare. What he tells me is repeatedly, from what he's gathered from HHS federally, they're not going to be able to operate their exchange the way they do now. They're going to have to make substantive major changes to be in compliance with that, which he's actually considering, even though he's had a successful exchange, just deferring to the federal government, because he says this is not a state exchange. This is a federal exchange with somebody at the state technically being in charge of running it, but it's the same as if you defer to the federal government. So because of that confusion, my sense was, why would I want to risk putting the taxpayers, in terms of any potential risk of cost? Today it doesn't say that in the law. Today it says it's self-funded, so jump on, the immediate response that naysayers to our policy would say, but like so many other federal policies, just because things start out that way doesn't mean that it stays that way. And without concrete answers, we just felt it was easier to defer still in compliance with the law. People in the state still get the exchanges. It just removes some of the uncertainty. When I went last week, when I was at the White House, I was there as a part of the leadership of the National Governors Association. So I didn't specifically advocate with Wisconsin examples because we all agreed if there's 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, and we tried to talk about were things we thought all 50 of us were in agreement, which you can imagine split parties, demographics isn't always the easiest, but we looked at things like saying if you're going to have savings, let the states share in the savings in the sense that if you're going to cut aid for things like Medicaid, give us greater flexibility in how to do with that. Help us deal with things like dual eligibles, which are individuals who are eligible for both Medicaid and Medicare, but the government typically pushes over to Medicaid because the state pays a reimbursement as opposed to Medicare. Do things like give us greater deference towards the National Guard, which is more cost effective in terms of resources for the Department of Defense than just putting it all in active duty. Do things like give us more flexibility in some of the other programs like special ed or others that we don't have a one-size-fits-all mentality out of Washington. That being said, specific to your question about Wisconsin, I also warned generically with the president not only about the fiscal impact on the states, but the economic impact, because Wisconsin, like most states, have slowly seen a recovery, but it's still pretty slow. We'd like to see it take off at some point in the future. I've said to not only the president but the speaker and others, there's a risk financially and there's a risk economically of nothing happening. But there's also a risk economically and financially if they do something, depending on what they do. And so when people say, have you planned for, prepared for different scenarios, it's downright near impossible just because there's so many moving pieces. But if nothing happened, you've got the payroll tax holiday that goes away, and so everyday hardworking taxpayers are going to pay more. So that's money out of the hands of consumers. That could have a tremendously negative impact on the economy, particularly if people are worried going into the end of the holiday shopping season. If they're holding on to some of their money, that could be a problem. You already see the impact it's playing on people not knowing, and that there's this huge wave of dividends that corporations are paying out, and if people are holding on to that money, not making that investment in new companies, there's a concern there. There's on the economic side, if they do nothing, there's going to be a whole series of cuts that will automatically kick in, which will have a negative impact on the economy nationwide, but here in Wisconsin. But on the flip side, some of those things may or may not, those may be some of the same exact concerns if they do pass something. In that, with defense contracts, we're not huge compared to other states. As stories came out again this week that we're pretty low on the pecking order in terms of return of federal tax dollars to the state, but for a Marinette Marine, for an Oshkosh Corporation, those are all defense contractors that would feel the pinch, and that would have an impact on jobs. Potentially payments for Medicaid would have a direct impact on the state budget in terms of they take a bunch of that and they don't give any tools for us to deal with it. But even economically, there's even it's more so not small businesses, but more so in terms of the stock market and things of that nature are very concerned about nothing happening with the fiscal cliff. What does that mean in terms of them freezing things up? And if they freeze things up, does that have a ripple effect? I was just at an employer the other day. It was a small business, but they supplied to big companies like P&H and Caterpillar. Well, if those companies are clamping down on their orders because of the bigger concerns about the market, well, then this little guy gets less engineering work and less supplier work. So I wish I had a clear answer. The problem is I think there's a tremendous problem economically and fiscally, both in doing nothing and potentially something happening, depending on what they ultimately pass. Because there's all this talk about tax increases. Well, like I said, there's the middle class tax impact that the payroll holiday has, but there's also, depending on where they take it out of from the taxpayer, if they tax certain groups, well, unless there's some way they can single out that doesn't apply to small businesses, a lot of small businesses, at least in our state, don't pay corporate, they pay individual. And if suddenly now an S Corp or an LLC is paying higher taxes, is that less money that goes into capital investments? Is it less money that goes into hiring people because of those investments? All those things are a great concern. Our key is we're putting our budget together the way we see things in the state right now, and we know we're going to watch day by day, because it seems to change, not just day by day, hour by hour, as to what likely might be there, and we'll have to adapt accordingly. That's why the best message that the governors gave was, not just on my behalf or Wisconsin's, was any changes you make to the White House, to the Senate, to the House of Representatives, give the states the maximum degree of flexibility to deal with this possible. Don't lock us in, don't box us in. We're willing to play a part in this. We don't want to play at all. And we don't want to just have a slope that comes down to the states and to the local governments. But we understand that some tough decisions are going to have to be made, but give us a way to deal with it. I go back to where you started originally. Whether you agree or disagree with what we did with our reforms, the fact is we didn't just say we're going to cut it. Having been in local government for 8 years, I said I knew the only way you could balance a state budget without raising taxes, without massive layoffs, and without cuts in things like Medicaid, to affect needy families and children and seniors, is cutting state aid. It's about 60% of all the state budgets, like the big entitlements out in Washington. The difference was, unlike years past where people tried to cut state aid, we at least gave schools and towns and counties and villages some tools to, in most cases, offset nearly all or close to all of it, and that helped them adapt. We're saying the same thing at the federal level. Give us something to help us adapt to it. No, and a couple differences. When I was at Appleton, somebody asked me that specifically about the comparison between Michigan and Indiana. I said, well, we've got the UP up to the north. Really, our main competition statewide is Illinois and Minnesota, particularly out of the Illinois and Twin Cities market. Neither of those have, nor are they likely to have, any debate over right to work or anything like that. Really, for us, the comparison in the past we've kind of played up has been Illinois. Huge contrast from what we did to balance our budget versus what they did. They raised taxes 67% of businesses, 46% on businesses. They claimed it was going to solve their budget crisis. In many ways, it made it worse. A year later, they still have budget problems. They proposed closing 14 state facilities, laying off thousands of public employees. Their pension system is the worst funded in the country. It's only half funded. Their bond rating just went down, and they're not, they've got a bond rating that's one of the worst in the country. Conversely, we made tough, but I would argue prudent, important decisions. We took, whether you want to call it 3 or 3.6, somewhere in that range, and we turned it into a surplus. The first time ever we put money aside in the rainy day fund in 2 consecutive years. We put the biggest deposit in the rainy day fund ever. Our surplus combined with our rainy day fund is nearly $500 million worth of reserves. Now we'd like more. In the future we're going to try and build that up. But that's why the bond rating agencies say we're credit positive. It's why our pension is the only fully funded system in the country. Our overall tax burden went down. Our business climate, in all the rankings, it went up 21 on CO Magazine. It went up a dozen spots in CNBC. It went up, first time in 14 years, we broke the top 25. We're now number 13 in Site Selectors Magazine. And in the state, our employers went from 10% 2 years ago who thought we were a good place to, we were heading in the right direction, to 94% who think we're heading in the right direction. So I look at all those comparables and say we're going to build off the things we've done. We're going to highlight those 5 priority areas I mentioned. But in terms of right to work, I just think after what we experienced a year and a half, year and 3 quarters ago, that would just be a huge distraction from the things I think otherwise fit in those 5 priority areas that we can do, that I think by and large would not only get Republican support, but I think a lot of those issues can get Democrats, or at least some Democrats, voting with us on. I think most people in the state, just, you mentioned voter fatigue, just want the stability of saying, hey, just get back to work. We don't, bold things are great, hugely bold things like what we did before, what Michigan and others are doing. This just isn't the time or the place. Well, I'll separate, because I think they're, even though they both involve the word mining, I think they are distinctively different. I think on the frack mining, and we have by far the best sand in the world. So we're an area. It's amazing. I had a kid, John Kasich from Ohio, who talks about how he and Pennsylvania have all this new shell deposit. I said, but you can't do without the best frack mining sand in the world, which is from Wisconsin. So we're proud of that. It's put a lot of people to work. It's particularly you start from west central all the way up to the northwest. What we'll probably do in the Department of Natural Resources is ask for some additional staffing in the budget to do more review of that. There's already a process that's in place But now, because of the number, we think just to be able to stay on top of that, to make sure, excuse me, that we're complying with all the existing clean air, clean line, clean water, public safety standards are in place. I don't know what the exact number will be, but they've asked for a couple new positions in that regard. That's something we're inclined to do. We're inclined to support that, just because we think staying on top of that is incredibly important. Putting more time and effort into that, and making sure that what's done. I mean, there's a potential with the growing number to have a great difference between operators who've done this before versus those that are just starting up and may not be as familiar. And I think we want to make sure that we have high standards and that they're complied by everybody. Not that there's a high standard for some here and then others don't meet that. So frac sand, I mean, I think there's a legitimate future for that, but I also think it's one where we want to be mindful and have the staff in place to make sure that anyone who's doing that is complying with all the appropriate health and environmental standards. On the iron ore deposit, you're right. I mean, it's about a 1.5 billion tons of iron ore, mainly in iron, a little bit in Ashland County. To me, it just seems logical that iron ore, which is one of the safer, more efficient ways of seeking a mining operation, that we should be able to do that. What I'm looking for, what I've asked the legislature for, is send me a bill that streamlines the process for safe and environmentally sound mining. Doesn't approve a mine, it just streamlines the process. We've got a company that's willing to invest $1.5 billion that potentially could put anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 people to work, not just at the mine, but with components, offsets of that all the way down to the Chippewa Valley and the Fox Valley and other places where a number of companies would benefit from it. Let's figure out a way to do that. The reason I believe a company like that needs to have a streamlined process is if you're any company, you're willing to invest $1.5 billion, what they want to know is with that kind of investment that the rules aren't going to change, that they know what the hurdles are, what they have to do, that it's science-based and it's predictable, and if they can hit each of those hurdles, which will take some time, they should ultimately be able to go ahead with these operations. But what they fear and what they've seen in the past is a concern that somehow that would shift throughout the process, and I think they're very, very concerned about this. So what I've suggested is, one of the two chambers passed a version that was like that, crafted by the Joint Finance Committee. Start with that. There's been Senator Cullen's committee, there's been Tim Sullivan coming on it, there's been others coming on it. There are changes or modifications you make, but start with the version that we know is already passed. Build off of what people believe are reasonable modifications or changes to that. Still want clean air, clean land, clean water. That's vitally important to the state's economy when it comes to tourism and agriculture. But conversely, just passing a bill and putting a piece of duct tape on it and calling it a mining bill, if it doesn't actually lead to a mining company coming in and making that investment, putting people to work, really isn't a mining bill.
When you're talking about a company, is it you're talking about the same company?
GTEC. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, because
they pulled out, but they're still interested.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and the reason I say them is just because they've already taken action for the land that's there, where we know there's 1.5 billion tons of iron ore deposit. So people say, why are we doing something specific to a company? Well, in this case, it's not like a company, hypothetically, we're picking a company wanting to come in. This is somebody who's already, made land purchases, brought in staff, already done preliminary work on that. We'd like to figure out a way, knowing that they're interested. Now, they were put off, they were upset, they were frustrated with the process, but my belief is there's still, ultimately, if we have a process by which it's streamlined process for safe and environmentally sound mining, they still have a financial interest in 1.5 billion tons of iron ore. That's not going anywhere. That's something they can pick up and move. They can move their interest in their operations, but in the end, there's still a sizable iron ore deposit in that location, and so since they had first dibs on it, they're still ultimately the ones that are going to be the first one interested. Could they change? Sure, but I think after that much time, if a bill was passed and it was called mining, but it really drug the process out for additional 3 or 4 years and added insurmountable hurdles, then they probably follow through with what they said. If it's just a year later and it gets to a process that's reasonable, then I think they'll stay here. Making some sort of an adjustment, we think it's reasonable, particularly in light of the fact that all of the people you mentioned, as well as me, I took about $11,000 hit in terms of paying more for pension contribution and healthcare costs and things like that. So believe me, our family feels it like just about anybody else does out there. So I get that. I think the last few years, while they've had a point, most of their neighbors probably have been in the same boat, or in some cases maybe to keep work have taken a cut. I'm not asking them to do that. I think it's reasonable now that we've got our fiscal house in order. I mean, it's one of the benefits, and this is an interesting contrast. You think about Illinois, we have a completely different governing process, which you'd think would be much more friendly, at least to the unions and not to the workers. Well, in our case, we didn't have massive layoffs. We didn't do furloughs like Governor Dole did in the past. We made tough decisions, but we changed things to be more realistic with where others are in society. And now we avoided those mass layoffs, and we're in a much better position. We can't go hog wild. You know, we've got to be careful in terms of how we budget going forward, so we don't go back to the days of deficits. But yeah, I think there's going to be room for some sort of an increase, both a general one to adjust for, you know, overall for people's cost of living. I don't know if it's going to be tied in the CPI, but there'll be something in there. That's part of what, you know, the balance in the next month or so, putting the budget together. The other part is we've authorized, excuse me, departments have been working on it really for the last half of this year going into the next year in terms of performance incentives as well. That's one of the things I mentioned as part of the Act 10 reforms at both the state and the local level, is finding ways to empower state agencies as well as local governments to say if people are doing an exceptionally good job, if they're doing a great job of efficiently providing services for the taxpayers, if they're saving taxpayers money, if they're meeting or exceeding core expectations, just like we do with other employers, there should be a way to provide some sort of a performance incentive in there. And so we're allowing department by department to go through that, and they'll do that with some of the money that they've allocated. It's not new resources, but money they've allocated for things like this. And it's an area where, particularly with the UW, one of the things that I'm inclined to be heading towards more in the future is give them more, if not an outright block grant or lump sum, but more down that path to the system to say, here, we're going to give you as few strings attached as possible, resources, and then you go out and then, because to me it's from the UW standpoint, you know, they've argued over the years for increases, saying, well, you know, some of our professors do an exceptional job of not only teaching but of bringing in academic research and development that brings in new money in from grants and from private interests. I said, well, okay, if I give you a set amount, you can figure out how you want to, if you want to give more to those who bring in that, or if you want to give more into those who teach a certain number of courses, or more that hit some certain other performance standards, why not let the UW make those sorts of decisions, knowing in the end this is what you're going to get and you got to make do with it. The other thing, not only there, but as a parent, not just as a governor, of one kid in college and another one ready to go next year, one of the other areas we're going to look at is for students trying to find a way to help keep tuition at a reasonable level, particularly not just where it starts at, but where it goes over a 4-year cycle. I think most of us would agree objectively, if you look at comparables for all of the comprehensive, whether it's Eau Claire, La Crosse, Stout, Madison, you name it, that compared to other schools in their same category, tuition's a pretty good bargain. Where the hang-up comes, and where as a parent I can commiserate with that, is when you have in the past had 5, 6, 7% increases, even if tuition starts out at a nice level. Once you've made that decision that, hey, this school I want to be at, I can afford that tuition, if suddenly tuition is going up more dramatically than people's wages are going up, more than the CPI is going up, that becomes a challenge. So again, we haven't fixated on a certain number, but we're kicking around a bunch of different ideas and ways we can help each of our incoming class as a freshman be able to see their tuition increases managed to a more reasonable level. I mean, you'll get some symbolic things that are part symbolism, part substance. Not me, but for example, the incoming or presumption, this new speaker, Robin Voss, has named a couple of Democrats as co-chairs of some committees. That's part symbolism, that's part substance. There's little things like that, I think, help in the legislature. I think the biggest thing is, as the executive, as the head of the executive branch, as governor, is kind of trying to set the agenda It's why I mentioned this. There was a Democrat lawmaker in Appleton where one of my earlier stops was today, and I not only thanked him for being there, but a couple of times made reference to that particular lawmaker, saying the best thing I can do to help push that type of feeling, that bringing people together, is keep focused on pieces of legislation and budget items and priorities that focus in on those 5 categories I mentioned. Because the 5 things I mentioned are not uniquely partisan. They're not something where you say, oh, you only got to be Republican to believe in that or Democrat to believe in that. Those are things. Now, there are going to be some differences in terms of, the details of some of that. But I think conceptually, those are things. If you look at where we started in January of 2011, either early in February, on that special session on jobs, almost every piece of I think all but one, if I remember right, had both Republican and Democrat votes on it. I have to go back and look for sure, but I think it was pretty close to that. If we focus on things that are about creating jobs, developing the workforce, getting us moving in the right direction in those categories, I think those are things, you'll never get everybody. There'll still be some, there are going to be naysayers no matter what I say. I mean, I could come out and say it's snowing. People say, that's wrong, it's been sunny all day. There's no snow here, it wouldn't matter. There's no way, and I'm not going to waste my time trying to get every single person, but I think for reasonable people who are people of good faith and goodwill in both political parties, if I can come out and say, here are my priorities, I'm willing to work with anybody who's willing to work with us on that. And this is true even more so in campaigns, I'll say editorial boards talk about us working together. And then 9 times out of 10 when I talk to reporters, they don't want to talk about that because that's not interesting. What they want to talk about is what divides you guys. What did, respond to what somebody said who hates you on this. Or I'll give you a good example. You haven't brought it up, so it's almost dangerous for me to say it, but don't spend too much time on this. But for 3 weeks, there was an obsession over same-day voter registration.
That's our next question.
Yeah, well, I'll go right to the heart of that. I'll cut you to. So, what has changed? I gave exactly the same answer in 2010 when I was running for governor. In fact, I reminded one of the reporters the other day from the Journal-Sentinel that his paper printed it on September 21st, 2010, along with about 50 other questions I answered. Okay, I haven't said a peep about it since then. I give a speech at the Ronald Reagan Library where I talk about our reforms, economic, fiscal, and government reforms. Same speech or variation of speech I've given 100 times in the last 2 years. And then at the end, I spend a half an hour taking questions. And somebody from who identifies himself as being from Wauwatosa asked me, so what's next? And I answer almost verbatim, a few exceptions on a few smaller issues, but I give essentially a very similar outline to what I'd said 8 days earlier in La Crosse at the Small Business Summit, and what I said later that day at in front of one of the caucuses in the state Senate, where I talked about tax reform, where I talked about performance, tying performance into additional funds for education, and other things like that. And then after that question, somebody said, what are you going to do about voter ID and voting issues? And I said, well, we passed the law on voter ID. It's an issue out there, and I'm confident that ultimately it'll make its way through the appeals process. And I said on same-day voter registration, I just think it would be easier for poll workers and local officials running elections if we didn't have that. It gets overwhelming that day, particularly at the end of the day. Whether it was the Friday before or Sunday before, it just would be easier. I didn't say I'm pushing it. I didn't even say I was advocating. I didn't say it was bad. I just said it would be easier. Well, it's kind of like the telephone game we played as kids. A day or two later, mainly after Dan Bice, a reporter from Milwaukee, ran it on the front page of the Journal-Sentinel, suddenly it's like, this is my #1 legislative priority. All I did was answer a question. Now, do I retract from that? No. I mean, I still believe, just like I did when I ran for governor, that it would be easier for elections officials if they had time, like plenty of other states do, to cross-reference, to make sure the lists are set up, that there are no problems with it. I do think it'd be easier. Is it something I think is an imminent priority? No. That's why I don't list it in my priorities. It wasn't something where I said something one place or said something different. I said it 2 years ago when I ran for governor. Now, I literally said it almost word for word as the way my answer was. Now, over the last 2 years, have I aggressively pushed that? No. Does it mean I'm walking away from it? No. But I'm just saying it doesn't fit into my legislative priority. It's like you asked about right to work. It's like I recently said about, when someone asked me about one of the representatives pushing an immigration bill, like they had in Arizona? I said, no. I said, anything that distracts from my ability to push forward on our legislative priorities and the things we're going to push in the budget in the legislature is something I'm going to push back hard on, whether I agree with it or not, because I want things focused in on those 5 priorities, which goes to your earlier question and comment about how do you bring people together. You just like you do with any organization, if you've got a meeting of the paper here as a business, and you've got 2 or 3 people who want to talk about some problem they have with something in the lunchroom, and you want to talk about the future of the paper, as a good leader, you say, okay, you guys can talk about that some other time. Right now, we're going to focus on what we need to do to up subscriptions or whatever the big issues out there. Same thing's true here. It's not that I disagree with that issue. It's just what I've said before is it's ridiculous because I gave an answer, not unlike the one I gave 2 years ago, but just because I answered the question. I mean, my problem, I guess, compared to other politicians is I actually answer questions. And so I make stories, I guess, by that. But in the end, my priorities, the things I've laid out, those are the things I repeat over and over again, and those are the things I want to talk about for the next 2 years.
And voter registration isn't one of those.
No.
That's a distraction.
No, I think it is a distraction. Just because of all, I mean,
Right.
although I got to tell you, again, cynically, and I don't say you guys this, but there are some groups, I think, who've been pushing the counter-protest to that, who want the debate, who want to draw more attention to it, because they don't have a good counter to any of the issues we're pushing on economic development and the 5 priorities, and so they thrive off of tension, they thrive off of looking like they're fighting me in the whole bit, and it's hard to fight me on the 5 things I keep talking about, so they want to have these other battles that they think are easier to get people worked up for, and for some of those groups, they're easier to raise money for them off of.
So will you sign it if it comes to you?
Well, I said I'd support it. I mean, I didn't back away from my support for 4, but to me, I just think it's a huge distraction. Not to mention, this case more so than even other issues is because of the motor voter law and the federal issues out there. Just because philosophically I might think it's easier, doesn't necessarily mean it's even in its current state a good idea, because there's potentially some federal cost associated with that because of the motor voter law. So unless that changes, I mean, it's one of those where you say, yeah, it'd be nicer, but if it's going to cost me more money, my bigger priority is keeping my budget balanced and focusing on these 5 priorities. It runs contrary to that.
And Matt just did it, right?
Yeah.
So it's obviously convenient for some people.
Well, but my son pointed out, and if the registration requirement was Friday before, he would have done Friday before. I mean, that story to me was like a dog bites bone story. Actually, a great analogy of that, it's like if I say, it would be easier for law enforcement if the speed limit was 55, and somebody ran out and did a story saying, Governor's son drives 65, and 65 is speed limit. Okay, it's the law. It would be different to me. I think it would be, some use the word hypocritical. It's not hypocritical at all. Hypocritical would be if I said there was something bad about same-day voter registration. Never said that. Said it'd be easier. It's the law. It makes sense. I probably 30 years ago registered at the polling place the first day I did there. But I know, just like my son, if the law was the day before or the Friday before, I'd comply with it that way. I don't think it's that difficult. I think it's human nature. It's why so many people wait to pay their taxes until sometime in April, a week or 2 before the 15th, and most of us don't pay our taxes early in January. It's human nature. Whatever the date is, that's what you'd be the closest to. I'm not a lawyer, but that argument is pretty lame. We already have protectives. If that's the case, then protectives are already in violation of the Constitution, because the law has been long before I was there that protectives get a different retirement multiplier than do other local and state employees. So it's not just the Attorney General's office, it's not just my counsel, just about every law firm in the state that advises state or local, or that advises any form of local governments, has said this is a very weak argument. Not just that, but the whole premise of that suit. So I'm very, very confident that in the end, either in the appeals court or ultimately in the state Supreme Court, it's going to be upheld. You can disagree with it, but I mean, to me, this is one of the things that frustrates, I think, a lot of voters out there. This idea that, there's been all these steps. There's been an election in 2010. We acted on things. I mean, I even talked in 2010, I ran an ad about asking public employees to pay 5% and 12%. So it's not like this came out of nowhere. You can disagree as to the exact bill or that, and I don't want to spend all my time rehashing it, but talked about it there, talked about the fact that my promise was to balance the budget without raising taxes, without massive layoffs, without cuts to core services like Medicaid. I hit every one of those promises. Unlike other states that cut into all those things, did all those things. The only way to do that is to cut back on local aids, and as a local official, the only way to do that without gutting core services at the local level is to give them the tools to respond to that. We did that. There was a series of elections in the recall in 2011. There was a series of elections in June of 2012 where I, in the Senate, won certain elections, and we've had a vote on this, and ultimately, people can disagree with it, but the way to disagree is in 2 years, elect a new governor, elect new legislative majorities. But to go back and try and have a judge, when a judge last year already ruled against it, and then it worked its way up through the appeals process and was upheld, to me it just seems like for a lot of people they keep saying, at what point did people just say that's the law? And they have every right legally to push this as far as they do. I just think in the end it will be upheld. How much do you put more state aid in, and then put levy limits in place so there's more assistance to help local governments? But I think there's got to be some sort of a check, because the last thing we want to have is property taxes fly through the roof, because for a lot of seniors, for a lot of working families, for a lot of young families, for a lot of small businesses, that property tax has been a big deal for them.
The last estimate I saw was a rainy day fund of about $467 million. We asked the question last week, what should the government do with the money?
When you say that, it sounds like a big number, but you look at it as a total of the budget. If we had $1 billion, I mean, what people don't realize is we've got reserves, rainy day fund plus surplus out there. We'd like to build the rainy day fund, and to me, part of the way you do that is not necessarily by putting money in the front end of the budget, but you continue to put requirements that half or more of any generated surplus continues to go in, and that you have to have a super majority to pull it out for any reason, so that you're only pulling it out if there's like what we ran into in 2008, 2009 with the economic meltdown that nearly every state in the country had. Well, maybe that's something where to relieve a burden on cuts in Medicaid or cuts in schools, that you might tap into that. But that's one where you need a supermajority, so that both the parties have to agree that this is an extraordinary situation, and that it is still just a fraction of what we spend on the total budget. So it's I mean, you look at some states, there are plenty of states that are worse off. There are plenty of states that are better than we are. And long term, I think we'd just be in a better position. Not just that it would help with the bond rating, which it would. We're lucky that we have a fully funded pension system, and that our debt is pretty reasonable compared to other states. But having a larger rainy day fund certainly helps with our bond rating, which helps us long term with our budget because it costs us less to borrow. Most say, where are the 250,000 jobs?
Mm-hmm.
Those are the people who would tell you today, if I said it was snowing, that they'd say, of course it's not. It's 8 degrees and it's beautiful. They don't want to presume that it was based on 2015. They assume they're so upset about things, they're naysayers, they want to say no. But for people who realistically look at that, no. I mean, is it going to be tough? Absolutely. I mean, when I made that goal, I had no idea that you'd have, not only within the state, but people from across the country essentially under siege in this state for almost a year's time. There's no doubt that had an impact. The recall, all the protests, everything else had an impact on that. Because anything that provides uncertainty to employers, even from the standpoint of a lot of small businesses, said they waited to make any investments or any growth in the state till after June 5th, not just because of being concerned about the protest and the election itself, but being concerned about the fact that after June 5th, if I wasn't there, we might go back to the way things were before, and that scared them. So you get almost a whole year and a half worth of time that was kind of frozen in time. In terms of small businesses, other employers out there. So it's going to be more challenging to get there, but that's all the more reason why when I talk about those 5 priorities, that's all we're hunkering down on. Those are the things we want to stay focused on. We're going to start out with. Doesn't mean that there are not other important issues along the way, but that's where we're going to start, and that's where we're going to keep focused on. And if there are other things eventually they want to pass or debate or discuss that don't take away from that attention, maybe then we'll consider it. But anything that distracts from the focus on those 5 priorities, number 1 being creating jobs, is just a huge distraction. And I've said if you don't have a high aggressive goal, then you just constantly make excuses for going further down. You know, and if 2 years from now, we're looking at 248,500 jobs, there are going to be people out there say he's an abysmal failure. You know, and you know, you and voters across the state will have to judge. And hopefully, we're talking well over 250,000. But if I said no, I'm adjusted down to 200,000, well then I think all my cabinet, all my agencies, all the people I talk to would be focused on that number instead of 250,000. And what I found is by having a very aggressive, ambitious goal, is that not just my cabinet, not just economic development, but every one of my state agencies, and I'd say 9 out of probably every 10 organizations that come in that want to meet with me on something, all come back to say, no matter what the subject, all come back to saying, you know, this will be useful in helping you get to your goal of 250,000. And some are more better, you know, some are more realistic than others, but everybody is focused in on that. Everybody who deals with state government understands that's our goal, that's our objective. And if you back away from that, I mean, to me, it's kind of like saying, beginning of the season, if you're Coach McCarthy and you say, I'm planning on, you know, our goal is to get to the Super Bowl, and you get a couple tough games, and suddenly you say, well, we'd like to just make the playoffs. Well, that's not a very motivating goal. And suddenly now you start making excuses all the way through. Our focus is not because it's some political goal, because in the end, the reason I did that is because I believe there's that many or more people who need work in this state. And so more than anything on their behalf, I'm not going to let that goal go down because I want to get as close or exceed that goal as much as possible, because that means 250,000 more people since I've taken office, 250,000 more families now can put food on the table, now have a chance for a career, now control their own destiny, now are no longer dependent on things like unemployment benefits, and instead they control their own destiny through a job in the private sector that gives them more freedom and more prosperity. That's just a good goal to have all the way around.